Welcome back to Stormi Tells Ghost Stories Haunted New Orleans on my Girls Rock Productions channel. Remember to like and subscribe to my channel for more of my content and comment to help me out. By the start of the American Civil War, New Orleans had the largest cotton market in the world, and it was by far the richest city in America. Louisiana would secede from the Union on February 4, 1861, just 50 years after officially becoming a state. This was not a popular decision in New Orleans, especially amongst the merchants who relied on trade with the northern markets. Free African Americans in the city were also torn, as they were on the side of the Union that wanted to abolish slavery, give every man the right to vote, and public education for everyone. Even so, it was a general from Louisiana and his regiment that would open fire on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, starting the Civil War. The fall of New Orleans would actually come quickly because the Union knew that it was important to have control over the Mississippi River. In April of 1862, a fleet of 24 ships under the command of David G. Farragut was ordered to seize New Orleans. The battle would last days. Then Farragut would come up with a daring scheme. Under the cover of night, they would send a small number of warships full speed past the forts, smash the barricades, and push into New Orleans. This would lead to the fall of New Orleans. The occupation of New Orleans would last for 15 years until April of 1877, giving New Orleans the honor of suffering through the longest Reconstruction government in the South. In this week's video, we will be visiting some of the haunted mansions and bed and breakfasts around town. The house connected to the infamous general who fired on Fort Sumter, a mansion that was once home to one of the earliest families in New Orleans, a beautiful Victorian property that is one of the most sought-out places to stay, a boutique hotel that might have been home to nefarious operations ran by the infamous Jean Lafitte, and the most haunted mansion in all of New Orleans, the Beauregard Keys House, the Fleur de Lis Mansion, the Avenue Inn, the Jean Lafitte House, and the Lalaurie Mansion. Our first stop is a beautiful Greek Revival house that looks a little out of place on Charter Street, the Beauregard Keys House. Hey guys and gals, before we get into the story, if you like any of the arts and crafts you see me doing and may like to buy them or have me make something custom for you, check out my Etsy, where I sell some of my original pieces as well as some of the do-it-yourself pieces that I have already done in these videos. There is also an option for you to have me hand-make custom items as well. There is a link to my Etsy shop in the description box and comments below. Now, back to the story. Plot at 1113 Rue Charter has a long, rich, and sometimes dark history. It begins back in the early 1700s when it was originally planned to be an artillery storage building, but those plans would change when the Ursuline nuns would arrive from France in 1726, and the King of France signed the whole block over to the nuns. It remained religious property up until 1825, when Joseph Le Carpentier purchased the property. He would hire on Francois Corojoles, an architect from Baltimore, and James Lambert, a free African-American from New Orleans, to help build the building. Le Carpentier and his family would live in the house until 1835, when he would move in with his daughter and son-in-law, Alonzo Morphy, at Royal Street. So it just so happens that Le Carpentier's grandson was Paul Morphy, the youngest world-famous chess champion. Paul was actually born within 1113 Charter and later moved with his parents and grandfather. Paul was able to beat chess players that were years ahead of him in the age and skill from a very young age. He would try to make a career for himself later in life as a lawyer, but no one ever took him seriously. He was found dead in his bathtub at the age of 39, presumably from heat stroke. Le Carpentier sold the house at 1113 Rue Charter to Swiss consul in New Orleans and a Swiss immigrant named John Merle. His wife, Madame Agnès Philippon Merle would be responsible for constructing the parterre garden. She ordered 2 tall brick walls be built to enclose the garden space and added 2 iron-glazed windows so that passersby could peek through. These gardens were actually common in the French Quarter during this time because they would be kept in the rear of the house for 2 main reasons. One, the French Quarter smelt foul, so families would strategically place these courtyards to reprieve themselves from the smell. And 2, doing so let the Creoles believe that they were humble. Madame Merle's garden was known to the locals as the jungle, and it would certainly ruffle a few feathers of the Creoles. It would add to it that the house itself was such a traditional blend of French and American design, and the Creoles hated the Americans. Again, the Merles were unable to hold on to the property due to financial difficulties, and it was sold. In 1865, Dominique Lanata bought the property. Lanata was a grocer in the French Quarter and also the Consul General of Sardinia in New Orleans. He'd rent out 1113 Charter until 1904, collecting on the lease money. His first tenant was his most famous one, Pierre Gustave Touton Beauregard. Beauregard was considered one of the first and most respected generals of the Confederate Army. He commanded the troops of the Western Theater, fighting in the Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Shiloh, and the Siege of Corinth, Mississippi. He would even help save the city of Petersburg, Virginia, which saved the Confederacy from an attack on their capital, Richmond, Virginia. He would return home to New Orleans after the war in hopes of finding a new job. He did so as the president of the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad. He would find upon his return, however, that his wife's family had auctioned off her ancestral home and Beauregard was left without a place to stay. While mourning the loss of his bride, he would move into Lanata's rental home with his 2 sons. He would lease the property until 1868 or 1869 before moving his family to 229 Royal Street. Even though he only lived in the house as a tenant, the locals still began calling it the Old Beauregard House. When Beauregard passed away in 1893, his body was laid to rest in the Army of Tennessee vault in Madrid Cemetery. One of the darker periods of the property's history came under its next owners. The Giancona family would buy the house off of Lanata in 1904, all of whom were involved in a lucrative liquor business. They operated as a wine cellar on the first floor and for the first few years were living in the old Beauregard house where they lived lavishly. Rumors began to spread that perhaps not all was what it seemed at the mansion on Charter. It was starting to become the talk of the town that the Sicilian Black Hand, a sect of the Mafia in New Orleans, felt that the Gianconas were invading on their territory and not paying their dues. Pietro Giancona, the patriarch of the family, issued an invitation to 4 of the members of the mob, but this was a trap. In the middle of the dinner, the Gianconas stood grabbing their pistols and opening fire. 3 of the Black Hand members dropped to the floor immediately dead. The 4th was gravely injured. He would somehow manage to escape, but he wouldn't get far. He crawled out onto the cobblestone streets where he passed away. These assassinations took place with Pietro's 2 young daughters just down the hall in their bedrooms. The charges for the murders would be dropped in 1910 despite the Gianconas having all ties to the mob as well. Then, for the next 15 years, the old Beauregard house was kept up more like a fortress. While the house would belong to Pietro up until 1925, when it was put up for auction, it is believed that the men in the family had taken off years earlier, abandoning not just the house, but possibly even their young. It's on record that the 2 daughters that were present on that fateful evening were left to fend for themselves when their father disappeared. They sewed baby clothes and sold them in the French Quarter. At this point, the old Beauregard house was set to be demolished in 1925, and that is when Antonio Menino, a Giacona by marriage, made the purchase. He threatened to tear it down if preservationists did not step in. He would turn it into a macaroni factory. His threats worked. Concerned citizens came forth to relieve Menino of the property. The founders of the Confederate Memorial Hall, the Owens family, would make the initial purchase, but it was not until the New Hampshire-born writer decided that she had to live in the old Beauregard house. In 1945, Frances Parkinson Keyes moved in and began renovations. She re-added the parterre garden, which had fallen into disrepair. This is where she would write 30 novels, including Dinner at Antoine's and The Chess Players, which was about Paul Morphy. Keyes would live in the property up until her death in 1970, and it has been operated by the Keyes Foundation as a museum ever since. With such a rich history, it's no wonder that the Beauregard Keyes house is known for being haunted. The most common ghostly figures to be spotted are Civil War soldiers. The ghosts are almost always seen wearing their gray and butternut-colored uniforms. They are usually seen standing with vacant expressions on their faces, staring off into the distance. Within moments, their spirits materialize as if they were never there to begin with. These ghosts were first spotted back during World War II. Those passing by the house would also report hearing gunshots, the unmistakable sounds of groaning and shouting, while smelling the scent of musket fire. It is even reported that people have seen men with mangled limbs and blown away faces, horses and mules being slaughtered by grape shot and cannons, all while the pungent smell of blood and decay fills the air. Paranormal investigators believe this is due to attachment theory. This is the idea that a person's spirit can latch onto something or someone present at the time of their death. General Beauregard fought in two of the bloodiest battles of the American Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run and the Battle of Shiloh. It wouldn't be surprising if some of those who died around him attached themselves to something he brought back home, or the general himself. It was also reported by Frances Parkinson Keyes that General Beauregard himself is also still wandering around the halls of the home-turned-museum. She said that he was seen constantly poking around the house looking for his boots. Legend has it that he was a well-dressed man, especially when it came to his uniform, and he was buried without his boots, so he cannot rest until he finds them. Now, let's leave this house haunted by a famous Confederate general and head over to a bed and breakfast that was given a new life a little over a decade ago, the Fleur-de-Lis Mansion. If you had walked past 1216 Annunciation Street only a decade ago, the grand old mansion that would become the Fleur-de-Lis Mansion looked like a completely different property. The late 20th century was not kind to this Greek revival home, but with a little TLC from its current owners, Jim and Lauren, it was given a new life as an elegant bed and breakfast. The Fleur-de-Lis is one of New Orleans' most prominent bed and breakfasts and is constantly booked solid, offering outdoor showers, a 10-person hot tub, and even a party bus for guests. It's really no surprise that it is one of the top places to stay. But the walls of the former mansion have seen their fair share of the good times and the bad. Now, the history of the lot that the Fleur-de-Lis Mansion stands on extends long before the beautiful mansion was ever built. As one of the first families of Louisiana, the Soleils had acquired this tract of land from the Jesuits' plantation in 1763. Thomas Soleil, the patriarch, immediately set about making his new plantation prosperous. His original plot stretched from Calliope Street to Race, but when Soleil's neighbor, Dillard Sarpy, decided to sell a lot of his land to surveyors, Thomas took note. He watched as Lord Sarpi's land sold off at lightning speed and the revenue began rolling in. Thomas Soleil decided he too wanted to subdivide his land for prospective buyers. In 1810, he hired the well-known engineer Bartholomew Lagoon to do this deed. He would sell everything off except the third of a mile radius around his home. The new neighborhood would be named Faubourg Soleil. We will never know if Thomas would move on to conduct other business because in 1815, General Andrew Jackson led the Battle of New Orleans against the invading Brits. Thomas Soleil was one of the men who lost his life in the War of 1812. After his death, the house would remain in his family at least up until his wife's death, Marie-Thérèse Soleil, in 1823, which is when her children would begin to partition off the land. They would donate to the corner of modern-day Coliseum and Arado streets to the Catholic Church and supported the new church that was erected there in 1838. Just a few years prior to that, they would commission architects to build a pair of Greek Revival brick houses, one being 1216 Annunciation Street, which would eventually become the Fleur-de-Lis Mansion. The other was demolished in the 1930s. Thomas Soleil's granddaughter Emily and her husband Theodule Ferret inherited the Greek Revival in 1842 when they married. From all accounts, Theodule Ferret had worked as a clerk at a bank during his youth. After his marriage, he and Emily decided to make their permanent home at 1216 Annunciation, the same land her family had lived on since the 18th century. Ferret was wily, however, and over time his own land holdings grew too. By 1859, he had acquired 127 acres of land on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. He also became the Justice of the Peace and Parish Treasurer in Saint-Tammany Parish. The house that would become Fleur-de-Lis continued in the Ferret family until 1900, which is when Theodule would pass away and Emily would move to North Shore. It is after the Ferret family that the mansion started to lose its grandeur. There was almost a generation where not much is known about the history from 1900 to 1919 when the Hennessy family would purchase the building. The current owners were informed that it was a brothel during that time. Though there are no records or newspaper accounts that exist to prove this claim, if it were to have happened, it would have been during this period. Situated so close to the Mississippi River, the former Soleil family home would have been in a prime position for sailors coming in from port. Additionally, it was during the years 1897 to 1917 that the city of New Orleans legalized brothels down in Storyville. The regulated red light district was isolated to a 38-block radius in the French Quarter. Although a majority of the dens, the slang for brothels, were supposed to be in Storyville district, there's no doubt others would have existed elsewhere in the city. After all, New Orleans was always known for being a den of disease and prostitution. If 1216 Annunciation was a brothel during those early 1900s years, then it would have gone unlisted. No license meant no business. And the fact that the address never pops up as a busted brothel could only mean that whoever owned the bordello ran it smartly. The next family to move into the Greek Revival mansion wasn't like the high society families of the Soleil and Ferret families had been. The Hennessy family was a solid blue-collar family. James Joseph Hennessy was a boilermaker who belonged to the International Brotherhood of a Boilermakers Union, and his wife, Irene Wilbert, was a school teacher from Iberville, Louisiana. Though it's difficult to determine what events led up to the Hennessy family opening the Greek Revival's doors to boarders after they purchased it in 1919. They continued to lease the homes in the mansion all the way into the 1950s. They advertised the open rooms in the newspapers, and countless people and families moved in with the Hennessy family over the decades. The house would remain in the Hennessy family until the death of James Joseph Hennessy's son, Wilbert, in 1985. It would remain empty for the next 25 years until Jim and Lauren would purchase it and turn it into the bed and breakfast. The current owners have had quite a few paranormal encounters over the years since opening their business. Jim first experienced something uncommonly active about the house when he and Lauren were living in Fleur-de-Lis suite during and immediately after construction was complete in 2012. He was having problems sleeping at night. Every so often, the sound of a male's voice could be heard vibrating through the room's stereo system just above the bed. He could never decipher just what the words were being spoken, but the deep masculine voice he would hear very well. Another ghostly prankster can be found in the Red Room. This room is very elegantly decorated, and it has a spirit who likes to mess with one particular employee, Alma. While cleaning the Red Room, Alma would always place a heart-shaped crystal dish on the back of the toilet. Now, this is just a small accessory, and Alma probably wouldn't think much of it if it wasn't constantly moving on its own. No matter how many times it is put on the back of the toilet, Alma returns to the Red Room's bathroom time and time again, only to find the crystal dish laying on the top of the marble floor. No one knows who these ghosts are, but they also do not feel threatened by them. Now let's leave this charming bed and breakfast where the ghost likes heart-shaped dishes and head over to the bed and breakfast that's situated right in the Garden District, the Avenue Inn. If you are sitting out on the veranda of the Avenue Inn bed and breakfast, you can hear the rickety vibration of the century-old green streetcars rumbling by 4125 St. Charles Avenue. The 19th century building was designed in the Queen Anne architectural style and is set back from the main New Orleans road by a private garden oasis. Winding paths lead up to the beautiful mansion where you are greeted by the innkeepers Joe and Bebe Rebon. The Avenue Inn is situated in the historic Garden District, just steps away from the historic transportation and minutes away from Magazine Street and the French Quarter. So this is a prime location if you want to take in the full New Orleans experience. But this cozy little getaway even has a few skeletons in its closet. The home would be built when Henry Pickard, a wealthy New Orleans merchant, decided he wanted to have a new home commissioned for his family. He didn't hesitate when picking out the location in the much-desired Upper St. Charles Avenue area, or the Garden District, which was on the up and up during the late 19th century. Pickard would hire the famed architect Thomas Sully to design the property. And this was an exceptional choice on Pickard's part because Sully was considered one of the most innovative and original architects in New Orleans during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He would design homes with various architectural influences, including Queen Anne, Second Empire, Romanesque, and many others. 4125 St. Charles Avenue was finally completed in 1891 for a staggering $12,000, which would be about $425,000 today. Sully was so dedicated to constructing a one-of-a-kind property, and in almost every building he designed, he would design unique wooden medallions. At the Avenue Inn, or what was then the Pickard Mansion, one of these talismans can be found by the front entranceway, in the shape of a long arrow with curved and ridged edges. Henry Pickard would pass away just 11 years after its completion in 1902, and the property would change hands. After Pickard's death, the house was quickly snatched up by Moise Waldhorn and his family. Waldhorn was a Jewish immigrant from a German province between modern-day Germany and France known as Alsace-Lorraine. He would arrive in New Orleans in the 1870s and found work as a clerk at Isaac Levi's Canal Street loan shop. While this wasn't a bad place of business, Waldhorn longed for more. By 1881, Moise Waldhorn had full ownership of the People's Loan Office, a former bank at the corner of Royal and Conti Street in the French Quarter. He then converted the property into a jewelry and curios business, which was promoted as being full of antique treasures from old Creole families. Many of these items were treasures and normally were parted from with hesitation. You see, Waldhorn would normally buy these items off of Creole families who fell on hard times after the Civil War and were struggling with poverty. Soon, Waldhorn was traveling far and wide to accumulate only the finest jewelry and trinkets. And by the time he and his family moved into the Pickard Mansion on St. Charles Avenue, Waldhorn had built up the finest and most luxurious antique shop in all of New Orleans. One of his more colorful visitors was Josie Arlington, Storyville's most notorious madam, who would make an annual pilgrimage to the store every December to buy jewelry for the ladies of the night in her brothel. Tragedy would strike the Waldhorn home in 1910. Moise, the patriarch, fell ill. This illness would be so bad it would cause him to take his own life. On October 31st, 1910, a newspaper from Texas stated that Moise Waldhorn, a prominent jeweler and dealer in antiques, committed suicide at his place of business here today by shooting. His act attributed to his ill health. Despite Moise's untimely death, the family would continue to live in the house until 1919. For most of the 20th century, the Pickard family mansion would become a boarding house, and it was owned by the ultimate cat lady, Jeannie Ellison, who earned this moniker because she owned not 5, not 10, but 100 cats. I can only imagine the smell and the amount of kitty litter that was having to be cleaned. But anyway, known for being pretty eccentric, Jeannie would run the property as a boarding house for 45 years, but it was during this time that the Thomas Sully Queen Anne structure took a rapid decline. By the time Joe and Bebe Rabon had purchased the property, it was just a shell of its former self. They would repair it to its former glory and opened it up as the Avenue Inn in the early 2000s. Being in the Garden District of New Orleans, of course they play into the ghost and haunted house themes, but they have actually had some guests talk about experiences as well. One guest came down in the morning with a complaint. They immediately stated that they thought the property was supposed to be pet-free. When the Rabons responded that it was, the guests continued to tell the story of a cat that had appeared in their room just before they were going to bed, before just disappearing seconds later. Is this one of Jeannie's cats still enjoying their former home in the afterlife? Another guest would talk about hearing singing coming from the old nanny's quarters, even though the room was empty. And yet another guest stated that they heard knocking sounds which came from the dining room fireplace during a wedding ceremony. Now let's leave the former boarding house that was home to the ultimate cat lady and head over to a property that was the headquarters for not one but two infamous pirates in New Orleans, Jean Lafitte's house. Just along the edge of the French Quarter at 613 Esplanade Avenue sits a guest house with a mysterious origin and even more mysterious paranormal activity. The Jean Lafitte House may be one of the most haunted hotels in all of New Orleans. The history of the property begins all the way back in the start of the town. In 1718, when the city's founder, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne, arrived, Sieur Bienville, an ancient road, was needed for a quick passage from the Mississippi River to Lake Pontchartrain, 5 miles upriver. Espelon Avenue became that necessary passage for the French colonists in the early 18th century. The ancient Native American portage stretched 5 miles, and it became the easiest way to transport goods from the river through the connecting bayou St. John to the lake. Espelon Avenue would become a more residential area by the turn of the 19th century, and it was actually one of the most sought-out residential areas in the city in the 1830s. Even still, the passageway was still used by sailors, merchants, and even pirates. According to legend, 613 Espelon was once Jean Lafitte's captain's quarters, and possibly even the headquarters of René Baluch. The history of pirates in New Orleans is well known. The French crown was notorious for leaving its colonists to their own devices, and so the colonists learned to fend for themselves. Smuggling and piracy became all too common within New Orleans, and Espelon Avenue would be the perfect location to function as a smuggling route for black market trading merchants from the Mississippi River to Lake Pontchartrain. So it wouldn't be surprising if this thoroughway was also used by the infamous pirate Jean Lafitte and his fellow smugglers. And the owner of Jean Lafitte House believes that he has the proof. In 1984, the owner of the Jean Lafitte House decided that he wanted to try to put a pool in his courtyard. Being the property was in an area that was previously known as Frenchtown, he knew that digging anything could produce hidden historical mysteries. For instance, in 2011, a man on Burgundy Street decided he wanted to put a pool in his courtyard. He also knew to bring in an archaeologist first, and they had unearthed 15 waterlogged coffins that dated back to the 18th century. Well, during this dig, construction crews actually came across an underground tunnel that ran alongside the Jean Lafitte House and Espelon Avenue. While this isn't definitive proof that Jean Lafitte and his captain, René Baluch, were present on the property, it would make the perfect hideaway when trying to smuggle or escape. But also, this isn't the only thing they have found at 613 Espelon Avenue. The office manager, who started out as a carpenter for the owner, found more evidence while doing work on some of the rooms. Behind the plaster-covered walls were the building's original beams, and those beams had their own story to tell. During the early days of the colony, many sailors would realize once they had sailed down the Mississippi River, they had no way of sailing back up the river against the currents. So they would break down their flatboats and sell the lumber to locals for a little cash. When the carpenter peeled back the decaying plaster, he unearthed old shipwood, probably dating back to the late 18th, early 19th centuries. Some of the beams even still had the bolts that held the ship together and the original nails. The ceiling itself was a work of art, as it looked like the ceilings on board these ships. But the underground tunnel and the shipwood weren't the only clues. The office manager was trying to dig into the tile floor on the first floor in Unit 1 to fix what he thought was a broken sewer pipe, but he would soon uncover a little piece of history. As he was digging, he started to realize that he had found at least 5 or 6 different rows, some dirt, some cement, and even one that was a cobblestoned street. While he was down there, he was pulling up old medicinal bottles with the druggist's labels still on them, some coins, and other small objects. As strange as it may seem to come across roads this far below the street level, it actually is not uncommon. Many of the archaeologists actually have to dig 10 to 12 feet to get to the roads of the Roman Empire and the Iron Age. It became very apparent that the archival papers in the city libraries were missing quite a bit of information on the property at 613 Espelon Avenue, which only gives more credence to Jean Lafitte and his band of pirates and smugglers using the area. As you can imagine, with all this long and mysterious history, the Jean Lafitte house is extremely haunted. One of the main ghosts of the building is that of the ghostly woman in white. Seen from the second floor on the property's street side building, a ghostly woman dressed in white has been seen in the corner of the room off from the main stairwell. Her spirit is said to huddle in the side room, which overlooks the courtyard. Her features are indistinct, and she never makes a sound. 2 housekeepers would quit after working in the building for approximately a year. Now, these employees had multiple interactions with some of the spirits in the guest house, but on this day, the housekeepers caught sight of the ghostly woman seated in the upstairs corner room, and that was the final straw. They ran down the circular staircase and across the courtyard to the manager's office to tell him they were quitting and there was nothing that would change their minds. Other employees have seen this woman's ghostly silhouette, but nobody seems to know who she is. The best they can guess is that she lived in the Jean Lafitte house before it became a bed and breakfast. Guests will often hear what they describe to the manager as people partying in the building or the street in the middle of the night. The voices and commotion are so loud that guests will sometimes even get up to look out the window to the street below, only to find there is no one there. The most haunted room in the building, however, is Unit 1, the same room that the office manager found the roads beneath. The craziest story from this room actually involves the owner himself. One day, the owner was working on paperwork that he had to do at the table in Unit 1. The papers were scattered all across the table, and the owner had poured himself a glass of water, which he placed in the center of the table. While he was reading over the details in the paperwork, he heard the soft screech of glass sliding over wood. He looked up to see his glass of water scooting across the table. In shock, the only thing the owner could do was watch. He didn't really believe in ghosts or the paranormal, but there was no hiding the fact that the glass was moving on its own. It then teetered on the edge of the table before falling to the ground, shattering into millions of little pieces. The owner quickly jumped up and bolted out of the room, and now he is a firm believer. So much so that he leaves most of the reins of the Jean Lafitte house to the office manager and spends most of his time at the other hotel he owns in New Orleans. Now, let's leave this bed and breakfast that stands on top of a little corner of history and head over to our final stop in this video, the mansion where the lady of the mansion was extra cruel to her slaves in the 1800s, the Lalaurie Mansion. The haunted history of the Lalaurie Mansion in New Orleans is one of the best-known ghost stories in the entire city. For decades, it has been considered the most haunted house in the French Quarter, and in many of the early writings, it was just referred to as the haunted house. And without even the mention of the name, the locals know exactly which house they were talking about. Horrible things happen inside the Lalaurie house, so horrible that it has stained the property for just under 2 centuries. The origins of the paranormal tales about 1140 Royal Street began around 1832 when Dr. Louis Lalaurie and his wife, Delphine, moved into the mansion in the French Quarter. The house had not That house had not been the first one that was on the site, and for many years prior, it was actually known as the Remary House. During the colonial history of New Orleans, Jean and Henri Remary had lived here. Later, another house was built on this property and was passed into the hands of Barthélemy Louis de McCarthy, the descendant of an Irish gentleman who had acquired a title from the French government. Delphine Lalaurie was the daughter of de McCarthy, and she had been married 2 times before marrying Dr. Lalaurie. The house that stands there today was built by Delphine Lalaurie's father, and it would come into her possession after her marriage to Dr. Lalaurie. Shortly after moving into the mansion, the Lalauries became renowned for their social affairs and were respected for their wealth and prominence. Madame Lalaurie became known as the most influential Creole woman in the city, handling the family's business affairs and carrying herself with great style. Her daughters from her previous marriages were among the finest dressed girls in New Orleans, even though one of them was crippled. This young woman was rarely seen at public events or social gatherings. Madame Lalaurie was considered one of the most intelligent and beautiful women in the city. Those who received her attentions at the gatherings she threw could not stop talking about her. She was always a gracious hostess and made guests in her home feel pampered. They would dine on European china and danced and rested on Oriental fabrics, which were imported at great expense. And one of the main things she was known for by all her guests was her extraordinary kindness. But this was just the side of Madame Lalaurie that she would show her friends and admirers. There was another side to her. Beneath the delicate and refined exterior was a cruel, cold-blooded, and possibly insane woman. The finery of the Lalaurie house was attended to by dozens of slaves. Many of her guests would talk about her handsome mulatto butler who wore expensive clothes and had never left her side. She would even leave a sip of wine for him in her cup during her dinner parties. When the other slaves were seen, they weren't nearly as elegant. In fact, they were extremely thin and hollow-chested. It was said they would move around the house like shadows, never raising their eyes. And these slaves are the ones that would become the subject of the rumors that started circling around Madame Lalaurie. These rumors would state that she was brutally cruel to them. She would even keep the cook chained to the fireplace in the kitchen, and many others were treated much worse. It was actually a neighbor on Royal Street who would be the first to suspect something was off in the Lalaurie house. Whispers were spreading around the quarter that the Lalaurie slaves seemed to come and go quite often. Parlor maids would be replaced with no explanation, or the stable boy would suddenly just disappear. He made a report to the authorities, but nothing really came of it. One day, another neighbor was climbing her own stairs when she heard a scream and saw Madame Lalaurie chasing a little girl. This girl, Leah, was the madam's personal servant, and she was being chased across the courtyard by Madame Lalaurie with a whip. The neighbor watched as the girl ran from floor to floor until they appeared on the roof. The poor child ran down the steeply pitched roof and then vanished. Moments later, the neighbor heard a horrible thud as the small body struck the flagstones below. The woman said she later saw the small slave girl buried in a shallow grave beneath the cypress trees in the yard. A law in New Orleans actually prohibited the cruel treatment of slaves, and this story caused the authorities to finally investigate the claims. The Lalaurie slaves were impounded and sold at auction, but unfortunately for them, Madame Lalaurie convinced some relatives into buying them and then selling them back to her in secret. She had told her friends that the entire incident had been a terrible accident. Some of them did believe her, but most didn't, and the Lalaurie social standing began to decline. Stories continued to circulate about the horrible treatment of the slaves, and the party and dinner invitations were getting declined more and more. Soon, the family was politely avoided by other members of the Creole society. Then, in April of 1834, all of the questions about Madame Lalaurie were finally answered. A terrible fire broke out in the Lalaurie kitchen. Legend has it that it was set on purpose by the cook, who could no longer endure her master's torture. She stated that she would rather burn alive than take any more abuse. Regardless of how the fire started, it quickly swept through the house. Flames were pouring out the side windows of the house, and smoke was billowing through the rooms. The streets outside the home filled with people, and soon the volunteer fire department was on hand carrying buckets of water. The bystanders surrounding the house would begin to offer assistance. Throughout all this chaos, Delphine remained calm. She directed volunteers who carried out the expensive paintings and smaller pieces of furniture. She was intent on saving the house, but would not allow the panic to overcome her. The neighbor who had first raised suspicion about Lalaurie came to assist during the fire. He asked her if the slaves were in danger from the blaze. That's when Delphine barked back not to interfere in her family's business. This is when he would appeal to Judge Kanyang, who was a local official who was present at the time. They began searching for the rest of the servants and were joined by a man named Fernandez and several of the firefighters. When they tried to reach the upper floor of the mansion, the doors were locked. They would finally find a locked wooden door with iron hinges leading to the attic. Dr. Lalaurie refused to open it, so they broke it down. What they found behind that door left the men in shock and dismay. According to the New Orleans Bee for April 11, 1834, seven slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, were seen suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other. These slaves had been confined by the woman Lalaurie for several months, in the situation from which they had thus providentially been rescued, and had been merely kept in existence to prolong their suffering and to make them taste all that the most refined cruelty could inflict." End quote. Other accounts of the discovery behind the locked door detailed descriptions of all sorts of perverse tortures and experiments. Tales have been told of makeshift operating tables, slaves locked in cages, bodies cut open, and holes that had been cut into human skulls in order for the victims' brains to be stirred. In most cases, the New Orleans Bee is cited as the source for this horror, but a check of the records proves that they were all just rumors. Just the stories of the slave girl falling from the rooftop and the 7 emaciated slaves in the attic can be tied to sources from the 19th and early 20th centuries. As the mutilated slaves were being carried out of the burning building, the crowd outside gathered around. Only one of two friends remained beside Madame Lalaurie. Even her husband would disappear. Delphine's mulatto servant acted quickly. He slammed the heavy door that led to the street and quickly locked it. He then ran through the courtyard and locked the large wooden gates. This would seal the Lalaurie household off from the crowd outside. which was now waiting to see if any arrests were going to be made over the cruel treatment of the slaves. But nothing would happen over the next several hours that followed. Word began to spread of all the atrocities in the Lalaurie house. They began talking about the slave girl that was killed, the slaves who had been taken away from the Lalaurie family, and the rumors of the slaves who went missing and were never seen again. According to the reports, at least 2,000 people came to the courthouse to see the slaves who had been rescued from the mansion. The slaves received medical care and were pressed with questions about their captivity and abuse. A long wooden table was filled with the instruments of torture found in the attic. They included whips, shackles, and knives, some of which were crusted with the red stain of dried blood. One of the female slaves gave a statement that Delphine would even sometimes beat and torture them while the music and parties were going on down below. She would even still be in her ball gown when she would start beating them mercilessly. The slave woman even stated that Lalaurie had even beaten her crippled daughter for bringing food to the starving slaves. All the men present that night also gave official statements in court. Mobs still sat outside the mansion on Royal Street demanding that arrests be made. They would stand there for hours, but when nothing happened, the crowd started to become belligerent. They began shouting at the shuttered windows, and calls for vengeance were heard from the streets. By the time the authorities finally came to make their arrests, Delphine had disappeared. Legend has it that she fled in the night back to the old world, where she would live out the rest of her life in France. For almost 200 years, there have been reports of paranormal activity coming from the house, and unsurprisingly, many of the hauntings are attributed to Madame Lalaurie slaves kept on the property. Some of the most common reports are the sounds of moaning coming from the attic room, where the slaves were kept and tortured. Phantom footsteps constantly echo throughout the house, and many people who stand near the house have the feeling of being taken over by negative energy. Despite all the ghost stories and paranormal happenings in the mansion, it would be absurd to think that all of them are tied to Madame Lalaurie and her mistreatment of slaves. In 1894, a tenant who lived in the Lalaurie mansion after the mansion was turned into apartments was brutally murdered in his room. Police found his belongings ransacked as if someone had gone through them. It was believed by authorities that he was a victim of robbery, despite nothing of value being missing. There was an interesting account that was given to police about the murder from one of the neighbors. He claimed that the victim was having problems in his house. His friend wrote it off as imagination running wild. His friend then went on to claim that the tenant of the mansion told him that there was a demon in the house that wouldn't rest until he met his end, which ended up happening in the house. Some of the hauntings could very well be attributed to this murder victim. During the mid to late 19th century, the Lalaurie Mansion was also a school for all girls. At first, it had been one of the few mixed schools in the city of New Orleans, but politics during the Reconstruction era were convoluted, and surely enough, soon after the school at 1140 Royal Street was converted into strictly an all-girl African-American primary school. Within a short amount of time, reports of physical assaults came to light. The young girls would approach their teachers, tears streaking down their face with their sleeves rolled up. The exposed flesh of their forearms were scratched and bruised. "Who did this to you?" the teachers would demand. The answer was always one and the same: that woman. These girls were too young to be aware of Madame Delphine and the devastating tragedy some decades earlier. It was also unlikely that the teachers themselves would tell 6, 7, or 8-year-olds about the starvation and immoral torture of slaves some decades before. One must wonder if the young girls were playing pranks on each other, or if their claims that some phantom woman had scarred them was true. No memoirs actually exist from this period, just scattered accounts here and there. Was this actually Madame Mallory responsible for the scratches, or could it be something else entirely? According to a medium that had visited the mansion, the house is no longer haunted by those slaves who were tortured by Madame Mallory, but instead a little boy who likes to play pranks and a little girl who was often nervous. The helplessness and anger was gone from the building. Well, that concludes this week's video of Stormi Tells Ghost Stories Haunted New Orleans. I hope you enjoyed some of the darkest stories the Big Easy has to offer. From the mansion haunted by Confederate soldiers to the bed and breakfast that was once one of 2 townhomes. From the bed and breakfast that was once owned by the biggest jeweler in town to the bed and breakfast tied to secret tunnels. And finally, the mansion that was once an all-girls primary school for African American children. The Beauregard Keys House, the Fleur de Lis Mansion, the Avenue Inn, the Jean Lafitte House, and the Lalaurie Mansion. Don't forget to check out some of my other playlists while you are here on Stormi Teaches Music. I release a cover video on Mondays at 6 p.m. Eastern, and a video of me teaching the song covered on Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern. You can catch the live stream of the lesson on Wednesdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on my Patreon. On the Stormi Does Arts playlist, I have some partial videos of the live stream you can get on my Patreon for the gold tier or higher. These streams are done daily at 11 a.m. Eastern. There's a link to my Patreon in the description box below. Polls are still open for the next city. Now this one is probably more likely going to be in January because it's looking like New Orleans is going to need 2 months like Savannah. But comment below for A, Dublin, Ireland, B, St. Petersburg, Russia, C, Madrid, Spain, or D, Rome, Italy. Also, I do have a one-time donation option on my Patreon that goes towards building a new form of public school. This would be a non-profit organization that will teach our children how to think, not what to think. I believe in recent events, it has been proven that the current public system is toxic here in America and has been indoctrinating the most innocent and those who should be most protected. Everything donated to that option on my Patreon goes 100% into this fund. I am also open to teaming up with people from PragerU, TPUSA, and any other independent, moderate, or conservative, and even liberals if they're not into the whole far left radical socialism that we have been seeing rising in that side of the spectrum over the last 15 years. Any content creators who would like to help that believe in this cause, I will be open to those ideas as well. Finally, check out Stormi Talks True Crime for some of the most heinous crimes in U.S. history. Well, not U.S., in history. New videos are posted Thursdays at 6 p.m. Eastern. Now, for anyone who wants to make a one-time donation to this channel to help keep it running while I'm building my audience, there is the QR code to my Venmo and CashApp on the screen. There's also a link to both in the description box below. These donations will help make sure that I am able to get these videos up on time. I would have more time for the recording, filming, and editing that I do all on my own. So any help is greatly appreciated. If you are ever in the Wilmington, North Carolina area, sign up for the Wilmington Ghosts Walking Tours or the Wilmington Spirits and Spirits Pub Crawl with U.S. Ghost Adventures. You can have me or one of our other talented tour guides show you around our historic downtown and hear some of the darkest stories the beautiful city on the beach has to offer. While you're here, if you decide you want to stay or buy a vacation home, check out my Moving to Coastal Carolina channel and contact me, as I am a licensed realtor here in the southeastern North Carolina area. Now tune in next Tuesday at 6 p.m. Eastern for the next video on Stormi Tells Ghost Stories, Haunted New Orleans. Until then, have a great week and stay safe.